I remember being in my senior year of college. The year before, I had graduated from the police academy, and while I finished school, I was working part-time for the Indiana University Police Department. I worked football games, basketball games, and foot patrols around the dorms. Typical college policing stuff, and honestly, I loved it. By that point, I already knew policing was going to be my career. Around the same time, IUPD got a new chief of police. Now, he wasn't nearly as popular as the previous chief, and he didn't have anywhere near the same level of experience. But he stepped into the position with something to prove. You could feel it almost immediately. Policies changed overnight. New directives came down consistently. A lot of it felt like change for the sake of change. And the full-time officers were getting frustrated fast. The part-time officers? We mostly kept our heads down. We were young. Most of us were 21 or 22 years old, about to graduate from college, trying to start careers. We weren't looking to make waves. Then came the diversity training. I don't remember the instructor's name or even the organization he was from. What I do remember is him standing in front of a room full of police officers and essentially telling us that all police officers were racist. Not that bias existed, not that departments should examine culture or hiring or training. No. His argument was that policing itself was fundamentally racist and that every officer in the room was part of the problem. Now, you can imagine the reaction that got. It's difficult to have a real conversation when you're being told you're evil before the conversation even starts. It's hard to learn anything when you walk into a room already under attack. And what made it stranger was that this training wasn't just for veteran officers. The part-time officers were there too. College students, young officers, people who were actually open to new ideas and discussions about the profession. But the approach never changed. Enter Chris Doherty. Chris was one of my classmates, a fellow officer, extremely smart. She was working on her master's degree in criminal justice at the time, and as the instructor kept throwing out statistic after statistic, claims presented as absolute fact, Chris raised her hand and asked a simple question. Not an angry question, not a political question, a professional question. She said, "Can you name the specific study you're quoting, and can you explain the validity and reliability of the results?" And that was it. Honestly, it was probably the most educated question asked in the entire room, and the instructor just froze. He looked stunned because suddenly somebody was asking him to defend the evidence behind what he was saying. But he never answered the question. Instead, the chief, who'd been standing by the door the entire time, absolutely erupted. He started screaming at us. 30 part-time police officers, most of us barely old enough to buy a beer, college seniors trying to begin our careers. "You are the problem," he yelled. "You're all racist, and questions like that prove it. Now shut your damn mouths and listen to this man or I'll fire you." And just like that, the room changed. Not because people suddenly became enlightened, because trust disappeared. That moment has stuck with me for years because it taught me something important about police reform. The second people stop being allowed to ask questions, real reform dies. Real reform requires honesty. It requires evidence. It requires experience. And most importantly, it requires conversation. Not lectures, not slogans, and not screaming people into silence. That's what this podcast is about. Not defending bad policing, not pretending problems don't exist, but talking honestly about what real police reform should actually look like from the perspective of the people doing it. Because for too long, police reform has been happening to officers instead of with them. And that's how you end up with bad policy, dangerous policy, and officers who feel abandoned by the very people making decisions about their profession. This season, we're going to talk to the people on the street. Patrol officers, trainers, detectives, supervisors, the men and women actually doing the work. Not because they're perfect, but because if you want to reform policing, maybe you should start by listening to the people who actually police. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Before we talk about where policing is going, we need to understand where it's been. Because police reform isn't new. Not even close. In fact, policing in America has been under almost constant reform for the last 60 years. If you go back to the 1960s and early 70s, America was in turmoil. Civil rights protests, urban riots, political violence, rising crime rates, distrust of government institutions after Vietnam and Watergate. Police departments all over the country were being accused, sometimes fairly, of corruption, brutality, political favoritism, and poor accountability. And to be honest, a lot of departments did need reform. Back then, many agencies still operated an old-school political patronage system. Training standards varied widely from one department to another. Some officers had excellent training and leadership. Others had almost none. Internal investigations were inconsistent. Policies were often unwritten. Documentation could be minimal. In some places, the culture was less professional law enforcement agency and more good old boys club with badges. So, reform efforts started gaining steam. One of the biggest early pushes came from the federal government after the 1967 Kerner Commission, which investigated the causes of racial unrest in American cities. The report criticized policing heavily and called for better training, a better hiring standard, stronger community relationships, and more accountability. Now, whether you agreed with every conclusion or not, something important came out of that era. Policing began moving toward professionalism. Departments started modernizing. You saw the expansion of formal police academies, standardized firearms qualifications, use of force reporting systems, internal affairs divisions, written policies and procedures, better supervision structures. Colleges started offering criminal justice programs specifically designed for law enforcement careers. And organizations started emerging that wanted to improve policing from within. One of the most influential was National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE, which was founded in 1976. Now, NOBLE did some genuinely important things. They pushed for minority recruitment in policing at a time when many departments lacked diversity. They advocated for professional standards and better relationships with minority communities, and they correctly recognized that police legitimacy mattered. But this is also where we started seeing the beginnings of something else, the finger-wagging approach to reform. The idea that broad moral condemnation of policing itself could somehow substitute for practical solutions. Instead of asking, how do we improve officer performance, the conversation increasingly became, what is fundamentally wrong with police officers? And that distinction matters. Because once reform stops being about improving systems and starts becoming about assigning collective guilt, you stop getting collaboration. You start getting resentment. Still, despite that tension, the 1980s and 1990s were largely an era of increasing professionalism in policing. This was the age of structured training and specialization. Departments started adopting early warning systems to identify problem officers. Field training officer programs became more formalized. Crisis negotiation teams expanded. SWAT teams became more standardized after incidents like the 1966 Texas Tower shooting. And later, major hostage situations in the 70s and 80s demonstrated the need for specialized response units. Community policing also became a major focus. And before that phrase became a political slogan, it actually meant something practical. It meant officers getting out of cars, walking neighborhoods, building relationships with business owners, clergy, school officials, and residents before problems exploded. The idea was simple. Police work better when communities trust officers personally, not just institutionally. In 1994, the Clinton crime bill poured money into community policing initiatives through the COPS Office program. Departments hired officers specifically for neighborhood engagement and long-term community assignments. Again, whether you agree with every policy choice or not, the focus at the time was operational. How do we make departments work better? And here's the important part. Most reform during that era was still being driven by police professionals themselves. Chiefs, sheriffs, trainers, veteran officers, researchers with law enforcement backgrounds. The people writing policy generally understood what the job actually looked like. They knew what it meant to walk into a dark house not knowing who was inside. They knew what it meant to fight with someone twice your size in a parking lot. They knew what it meant to make life and death decisions with incomplete information in almost no time. And that matters, because good policy has to survive contact with reality. But somewhere along the line, especially starting in the late 1990s and accelerating after about 2014, reform began shifting away from professionalization and towards politicization. And those are not the same thing. Professionalization asks, how do we improve outcomes? Politicization asks, how do we satisfy public pressure? That shift became very obvious after high-profile incidents like Ferguson in 2014. Now, some reforms after Ferguson were legitimate and overdue. Body cameras, for example, often protected officers as much as civilians. Better reporting standards and clearer use of force policies made sense. But increasingly, policy wasn't being shaped by people with operational experience. It was being shaped by politicians, activists, media narratives, social media outrage cycles, and people who had never worked a street shift in their lives. And once politics became the primary driver of policing, professionalism starts taking a back seat. Policies start getting written for headlines instead of reality. Training becomes performative. Officers become hesitant, and departments stop asking, what works? And they start asking, what looks good on television? That's the road we've been on for the last decade. And whether people want to admit it or not, that road has consequences for officers and for the communities they serve. And that's really where the modern era begins. Because over the last 10 to 15 years, police reform has shifted away from being practitioner-driven and towards being politically and publicly driven. Now, let me be clear about something. That does not automatically make it wrong. Public input matters. Transparency matters. Accountability matters. Police officers work for the public, and the public absolutely has a right to expect professionalism, fairness, and ethical conduct from the people carrying a badge. And that's not controversial. But here's where things start to break down. Policy started being written by people who don't understand the operational reality of policing. And when that happens, you start getting reforms that sound good in a press conference, but fall apart in the field. Because policing is one of the few professions where the policy decisions are tested immediately, violently, and publicly. A bad corporate policy might lose money. A bad police policy can get somebody killed. And that's a very different level of consequence. What we've increasingly seen over the last decade is policy being shaped by political pressure, media cycles, social media outrage, and people whose understanding of policing comes almost entirely from cell phone videos that start halfway through an incident. Partial information tends to create emotional policy instead of operational policy. And emotional policy is rarely good policy. Let's take qualified immunity as an example. Now, this is one of those phrases that gets thrown around constantly online, usually without much explanation of what it actually is. Qualified immunity does not mean police officers are above the law. It doesn't mean officers can intentionally violate rights without consequences. What it means is that officers generally have protection from personal civil liability when they are acting within the scope of their duties and within clearly established law. That protection exists for a reason. Because police officers making decisions under conditions most people will never experience. Incomplete information, extreme stress, time pressure measured in seconds. And yet, over the last several years, there have been major pushes to eliminate or drastically reduce qualified immunity entirely. Now, the stated goal is accountability, and accountability matters. But here's the operational question nobody seems eager to answer. What happens when every decision an officer makes, every arrest, every use of force, every pursuit, every split-second judgment comes with the possibility of personal financial ruin? You don't magically create perfect policing. You create hesitation. You create officers who start second-guessing lawful action because they're thinking about lawsuits instead of the threat in front of them. You create officers who avoid proactive policing altogether because the personal risk outweighs the professional reward. And sometimes, hesitation is exactly what gets people killed. If an officer hesitates too long before stopping a violent suspect, if they delay action waiting for absolute certainty that never comes, if they choose not to intervene because they're afraid of becoming the next viral headline, the consequences can be catastrophic. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Policing often requires making decisions before all the facts are available. That's not bad policing. That's the job. We've seen the same kind of disconnect with certain use of force reforms. Now again, some reforms were necessary. There were departments with outdated tactics, poor training, weak supervision, There were legitimate reasons to examine how force was being used and reported. But increasingly, policies began restricting techniques or tools without fully understanding what replaced them. And that's where things become dangerous. Take certain control techniques that were heavily restricted or outright banned after 2020. On paper, removing those techniques sounded compassionate and progressive. But in practice, many of those techniques existed because they allowed officers to gain control quickly and end resistance before situations escalated further. When you remove an intermediate option without providing a realistic alternative, you don't necessarily reduce force. Sometimes you increase it, because officers still have to solve the problem in front of them. The suspect is still resisting. The threat is still there. The call still has to end somehow. So, if officers lose lower-level control options, they're often left with fewer choices, and those choices tend to exist at the extremes. Either disengage completely or escalate to higher levels of force when the situation deteriorates. Neither outcome is ideal. And this is where experience matters, because people who have actually fought with combative suspects understand something that often gets lost in political discussions. Real violence is chaotic. It's ugly. It's fast. It doesn't look clean on video. And policies written by people with no operational experience often assume officers have more time, more information, and more control than they actually do. That disconnect has real consequences. You can see it in officer retention. You can see it in recruiting numbers collapsing nationwide. You can see it in proactive policing disappearing in many cities because officers feel like the profession no longer trusts them to do the job. And once officers stop believing leadership, politicians, or the public will support lawful and reasonable actions, the entire culture changes. Officers become reactive instead of proactive. And reactive policing is almost always worse for communities. That's the part that almost nobody talks about honestly. Bad reform doesn't just hurt officers. Bad reform hurts the public too. And here's the part almost never gets talked about honestly by politicians, activists, or even police leadership. Every single policy decision made about policing eventually lands on the street. Not in theory. In reality, it lands on the patrol officer working nights in a domestic violence call. It lands on the deputy standing alone on the side of the highway at 2 a.m. It lands on the rookie officer trying to make sense of a chaotic mental health crisis while somebody films them from 10 feet away with a cell phone. That's where these policies become real. And the reality officers are working in today is dramatically different than what it was 15 years ago. Calls are more complicated. Mental health crisis has become a routine part of patrol work. In many places, police officers have effectively become the default emergency response for addiction, homelessness, severe mental illness, suicidal behavior, and social disorder, whether departments were designed for that or not. And that matters because police academies were traditionally built around law enforcement, crisis response, and physical control, not long-term behavioral health intervention. Yet officers are increasingly expected to function as police officer, social worker, counselor, medic, negotiator, and legal expert all at the same time. And they're expected to do it perfectly. At the exact same time, public trust has become more fragile than ever before. Now again, some skepticism toward policing is understandable. There have absolutely been bad officers, bad shootings, bad leadership decisions. No honest person denies that. But when every police encounter is immediately viewed through the assumption of misconduct, it changes the profession, especially when scrutiny has become constant. Not occasional, constant. Every use of force can become national news within hours. Every mistake can become viral content before an investigation even begins. Officers are now policing in an environment where they are judged not only by policy and law, but by internet reaction. Internet reaction is not known for patience or nuance. Now, layer all of that together. More difficult calls, higher public distrust, constant scrutiny, and then add unclear policies on top of it. Policies written so broadly or vaguely that officers themselves aren't always sure where the line actually is anymore. Then add training that often hasn't caught up with the expectations. Departments announce sweeping new standards, new de-escalation models, new reporting requirements, but officers may only receive a few hours of classroom instruction before being thrown back onto the street, expected to operate flawlessly under the new system. And finally, add a culture where many officers feel like one mistake, even a reasonable one, can instantly destroy their career, bankrupt them financially, or turn them into the next national villain. What do you think that environment creates? It creates burnout. And we're seeing burnout on a massive scale. Experienced officers are retiring early. Mid-career officers are leaving for other professions. Recruitment numbers are collapsing in departments all across the country. And the people leaving first are often the people you most want to keep. The calm veterans. The officers who know how to talk to someone. The officers who know how to talk someone down without force. The supervisors who can read a scene the second they arrive. The cops who have enough experience to recognize when a situation is about to turn deadly before anybody else sees it. Those are the people walking away. Not because they stopped caring, but because many of them no longer believe the profession or the public will support them for doing the job reasonably and lawfully. And when experienced officers leave, somebody has to replace them. That's not a criticism of younger officers. Every great cop was once a rookie. But it is reality. It means the people with the least amount of experience are increasingly handling the hardest calls in the most politically charged and policy-restrictive environment modern policing has ever seen. Think about that for a second. The profession is simultaneously demanding more from officers than ever before, while often giving them less support, less confidence, less proactive freedom, and less room for human error. That's not a recipe for better outcomes. That's a recipe for disaster. And disaster in policing is very, very dangerous. Not just for the officers, for the communities too, because eventually proactive policing starts disappearing. Officers stop engaging unless they absolutely have to. They avoid discretionary enforcement. They avoid proactive stops. They avoid getting involved unless the situation forces their hand. Not because they're lazy, because they're scared. Scared of becoming the next headline. Scared of losing their pension. Scared of criminal prosecution for making a reasonable decision in an unreasonable situation. And once fear becomes the dominant culture inside policing, the entire profession falls. The public feels it. The officers feel it. Communities feel it. And that's really what this podcast is about. Not pretending policing is perfect. Not pretending reform isn't needed, but asking a very simple question. What would real reform actually look like if it came from the people doing the job? Not from consultants, not from political campaigns, not from social media outrage, but from the patrol officers, detectives, trainers, supervisors, dispatchers, SWAT officers, crisis negotiators, school resource officers. The people who actually live this profession every day. Because if reform is going to work, it has to work in reality, not just in theory. And over the course of this season, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Real problems, real solutions, and what real police reform, for cops, by cops, might actually look like. So this season on Blue Canary, we're going to talk about police reform. But we're not going to do it the way it usually gets done. This isn't going to be a season built around slogans, hashtags, or 20-second political talking points. We're going to sit down with people who have actually lived this profession from very different perspectives and ask a simple question. What actually needs to change? Not what sounds good, not what polls well, what actually works. We're going to talk with a recently retired police administrator and college professor about the evolution of policing, what reform efforts got right and what they got wrong, and how leadership inside departments has changed over the last several decades. We're going to sit down with a retired FBI agent and discuss the issues he believes modern policing still struggles with, from training and leadership to public trust and institutional accountability. We're going to talk with a veteran and current DHS officer about the operational side of law enforcement, about preparedness, professionalism, and what happens when policy decisions are made by people far removed from the realities of the job. We're also going to have conversations that don't fit neatly into political categories. We're going to talk with an ex-convict whose brother-in-law was a police officer killed in the line of duty, because those perspectives matter too. Because sometimes the people who understand policing best are the people who've seen both sides of the criminal justice system up close. And we're going to sit down with a retired detective who now works counseling police officers dealing with trauma, stress, burnout, and mental health struggles. Because one of the biggest conversations policing still avoids is the emotional and psychological cost of the profession itself. And throughout all of it, I'm going to keep digging deeper into specific issues: training, use of force, recruitment, retention, leadership, mental health, community trust, accountability, and maybe, most importantly, how we actually fix things without making them worse. Because the truth is, the solution is both incredibly simple and incredibly difficult. We need to care. We need to care about the men and women in law enforcement who go to work every day carrying responsibilities most people never have to think about. We need to care about communities that want safety, fairness, professionalism, and dignity. We need to care about the people just trying to live their lives, raise families, go to work, and trust that somebody will come when they call 911. And ultimately, we need to be willing to invest in the future we actually want to see. Because real reform isn't built on anger. It isn't built on fear. And it isn't built on politics. Real reform is built on honesty, on professionalism, on accountability, on experience, and on people willing to have difficult conversations in good faith. And that's what this season is about. And hopefully, by the end of it, we'll all understand policing and police reform a little better than we do right now. And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.
The Legal Liability Risk Management Institute is the nation's largest provider of liability and risk management services in the United States. Our goal is to help reduce liability, reduce lawsuits, and enhance officer performance. Regardless of the size of your agency, we have a risk management solution. You may contact us at www.llrmi.com or call 317-386-8325.